So the concept of the marital load-bearing wall is something we really rarely think about when a relationship is functioning normally.
Right. Yeah. Because why would you?
Exactly. Like you move into a house, you admire the layout, you arrange the furniture, and you just completely ignore the invisible structures holding the roof up.
You just assume they're going to hold.
You do. But it's only when the foundation shifts, or, when a massive storm hits, that you suddenly realize the entire weight of the structure is resting on one or two critical points.
And if those points fail, the collapse isn't gradual, is it?
No, it's not. It is catastrophic, and it leaves you standing in the rubble, wondering how the shelter you relied on for decades turned into a hazard overnight.
Which brings us to today's topic. Because the structural integrity of a long-term relationship is tested by biological realities far more often than we like to admit.
Yeah, that's so true.
We kind of operate under this assumption of a static baseline, right? Like, we assume that the people we commit to will remain relatively healthy.
And that the division of labor will stay roughly equal. Yeah.
Exactly. But when you introduce the relentless grinding pressure of a chronic illness, well, that baseline is completely obliterated.
The load-bearing walls shift entirely. And that structural shift is the core of our mission today.
It's a heavy topic for sure.
It is. We are looking at a really brief, anonymous blog post written by a 70-year-old woman. She titled it, "The Fractured Vows of a Caregiver's Fatigue."
Wow. That title alone carries so much weight.
It really does.
Hmm.
And I want to set the tone right now for this deep dive. This isn't just some, analytical teardown of a situation.
Right. We're not just dissecting the facts.
Exactly. We are structuring this as a shared reflection and, frankly, as a gentle letter of support. It is directed to the author navigating this specific crisis.
And of course, it's equally for you, the listener, because you might be quietly managing your own complex relational breakdowns or health emergencies right now.
Yes, exactly. We want to approach this with clinical clarity, but deeply rooted in compassion.
So let's look at the facts the author provides us with, because they are pretty stark.
Yeah, lay them out for us.
Well, we are looking at a marriage that has spanned over 20 years. And for a significant portion of that timeline, the author has lived with lupus.
And lupus, that is a severely debilitating condition.
It really is. Because of the chronic fatigue associated with the disease, her husband has assumed the vast majority of the domestic labor.
Specifically things like cooking and cleaning, right?
Right. And alongside this, the author notes that intimacy has been scarce, which has created significant friction as sex remains very important to her husband.
Okay, so those are the long-term variables. But the acute crisis, the storm that brought the house down, happened very recently.
Yeah, the catalyst.
Exactly. She suffered a stroke. And upon returning from the hospital, right at the onset of her recovery, her husband initiated a brutal confrontation.
Just incredibly difficult timing.
Unimaginable. He stated he feels taken advantage of. He insulted her appearance, calling her fat and ugly.
That's just so deeply cruel.
It is. And he explicitly blamed her for his own inability to get an erection.
Yeah.
And then he threatened to travel to Thailand to find women who will, in his words, make him hard.
Goodness.
Yeah. And her post ends with a simple, desperate request for advice on how to respond.
The juxtaposition there is just jarring. You have a life-threatening neurological event followed by an immediate verbal assault. We have to dissect this carefully.
I really do.
We are going to analyze the long-term emotional strain of chronic illness and the psychological mechanics of caregiver burnout.
And we also have to deconstruct the devastating effects of that verbal abuse.
Absolutely. But the priority here is functional recovery. We must outline concrete steps for this author to rebuild her self-worth while she's under active psychological attack.
And even if you aren't in this specific situation, the underlying mechanisms we are exploring today apply universally.
Right. There's so much to learn here about human dynamics under stress.
Exactly. We are going to examine how you maintain personal dignity under severe compounding stress.
We're going to look at the mechanics of boundary setting when your physical autonomy is compromised.
And we are going to explore the concept of finding grace amidst profound personal pain.
It's so necessary.
Okay, let's unpack this. A marriage is supposed to be a partnership, but chronic illness turns it into a patient-caregiver dynamic. It's like signing up to be co-captains of a ship, but one of you is forced below deck by a decades-long storm.
That's a really powerful analogy.
Thanks. But, how does this massive shift in responsibilities, sustained over 20 years, begin to breed the kind of silent resentment that eventually explodes over domestic chores.
Well, to understand the genesis of that resentment, we have to look at the psychological ledger that develops in a caregiving dynamic.
The psychological ledger. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so when a partnership begins, there's usually an implicit, unspoken contract of reciprocity. I cook, you clean.
Right. I manage the finances, you handle the social calendar. It's a dynamic equilibrium.
Exactly, but chronic illness shatters that equilibrium permanently. The wife in the scenario did not choose to have lupus.
No, of course not.
Her systemic fatigue and physical limitations are physiological realities. They are completely devoid of moral failing or a lack of willpower.
Right. She isn't just choosing to sit out the chores.
Exactly. Yet the outcome of that biological reality is that the husband assumes a disproportionate share of the physical labor.
And we're talking about 2 decades, like 20 years of grocery shopping, meal preparation, and maintaining a home, largely independently.
The cumulative fatigue of that labor really cannot be overstated. I mean, caregiver burnout is a documented physiological and psychological state.
It's not just being tired, right?
No, it's characterized by emotional depletion, chronic exhaustion, and this is key, a slow erosion of empathy.
Wow, an erosion of empathy. That makes a lot of sense.
When an individual operates as the sole engine for a household over thousands of consecutive days, the brain's stress response remains chronically activated.
So his baseline fatigue is a highly predictable response to a prolonged asymmetrical burden.
Yes, he is tired, and that exhaustion is fundamentally valid.
The distinction we have to make, though, is the gap between a valid feeling and a destructive behavior.
That's a crucial distinction.
Like, the fatigue is real. The frustration of managing a household alone is real. But acknowledging that burnout does not provide cover for the weaponization of that fatigue.
Absolutely not. You can be exhausted without being abusive.
Right. We're looking at a situation where the resentment over laundry and dinners wasn't communicated through healthy channels.
Or mitigated through external help, like hiring a service if they could afford it.
Exactly. It was hoarded, it was allowed to ferment over years until it turned into something actively cruel.
And that fermentation process happens when a caregiver transitions into a martyr complex.
A martyr complex. How does that play out here?
Well, instead of viewing the illness as an external antagonist that they are both fighting together, the husband began to view his wife as the antagonist.
Oh, wow. So she became the enemy, not the lupus.
Exactly. He internalized her physical limitations as a personal affront. The chores stopped being tasks necessary for their survival and became a tally of debts she owed him.
That is just a critical failure in cognitive framing.
It really is. He took the objective reality of his labor and attached a malicious narrative to it.
Right. Convincing himself he was being taken advantage of, rather than recognizing he was supporting a partner with a severe autoimmune disease.
Yeah, and think about the psychological environment that creates for the wife.
It must be agonizing. I mean, the sheer mental endurance required to live below deck, to stick with that ship analogy.
It takes a huge toll.
You are battling your own immune system. You wake up with profound cellular depletion, and then you have to watch your partner shoulder the domestic load.
The guilt would be suffocating.
Absolutely. The temptation to apologize merely for for occupying space while sick must be a daily battle.
Which really highlights the absolute necessity of robust coping mechanisms for illness fatigue.
What kind of mechanisms?
Specifically, mechanisms that divorce identity from energy output.
Oh, that's tough, especially in our culture.
Right. In our society, worth is inextricably linked to productivity. We value people based on what they can generate, organize, or clean.
Yeah, the whole hustle culture mindset.
Exactly. For an individual with chronic illness, internalizing that societal metric is catastrophic to their mental health.
So how does she fight that?
Her primary psychological defense must be the active, daily realization that her fatigue is a symptom of her pathology, not a reflection of her character.
She basically has to construct a firewall between her medical chart and her intrinsic value.
Yes, that's exactly it. She is not her lupus.
Right. Her inability to stand at a stove for an hour does not negate her capacity for love or intellect or partnership.
And in a functional caregiving dynamic, the healthier partner acts as a secondary firewall.
They reinforce the sick partner's worth independent of their physical utility, right?
Yes. But here, the husband actively dismantled that firewall.
Hustle.
By harboring this resentment and framing her illness as an exploitation of his labor, he reinforced the most toxic insecurity a chronically ill person faces, the fear of being a burden.
That is so incredibly damaging. And that dynamic is drastically compounded by the issue of intimacy.
It always complicates things.
The author notes that sex is very important to him, but intimacy has been scarce. We know the reality of chronic autoimmune diseases.
Oh, yes. Pain, stiffness, profound exhaustion.
Not to mention the side effects of medications. All of that can effectively eliminate libido.
And the reduction or loss of sexual intimacy is a very common secondary casualty of long-term illness.
How do couples usually handle that? The healthy ones, I mean.
Well, couples who navigate this successfully undergo a period of intense mourning for the physical connection they have lost.
They grieve it together.
Yes, and then they adapt. They expand their definition of intimacy.
But the friction here indicates an inability or unwillingness to adapt on his part.
Exactly. He viewed the lack of sexual access not as a tragic symptom of her disease, but as another line item on the ledger of her deficits.
It feeds directly into the narrative of being taken advantage of.
Right. He perceives a transactional imbalance, like he provides the labor and she fails to provide the sexual reciprocation.
It is a devastatingly cold way to evaluate a decades-long marriage. But what is truly staggering to me is the timeline.
The 20 years.
Yeah. This ledger of resentment has been accumulating for 20 years. They have presumably maintained some sort of tense status quo for thousands of days.
It's a long time to hold on to anger.
It is. So we have to look at exactly when he chose to liquidate that ledger, because the timing of this confrontation moves us out of the realm of standard marital dysfunction.
And into what?
Into a profound layer of emotional abandonment.
What's fascinating here is the psychological significance of the specific trigger.
The stroke.
Yes, a stroke is not a gradual decline. It is an immediate, catastrophic neurological crisis. The brain is literally starved of oxygen.
It's terrifying. Survival is precarious, and the resulting deficits are often severe.
Coming home from the hospital after a stroke is a period of maximum vulnerability. The patient requires a sanctuary to begin the grueling process of neuroplastic recovery.
The hospital discharge is supposed to be the moment you finally exhale.
Right, you think you're safe.
You survived the acute crisis, and now you are back in your safe harbor, surrounded by the familiar.
But that's not what happened here.
No. To choose the exact moment she crosses the threshold to initiate a hostile marital breakdown is surgical in its cruelty.
Surgical is the perfect word for it.
It is dropping the floor out from under someone who has barely relearned how to stand.
It is the ultimate subversion of the caregiver role. At the precise moment she requires the highest level of stability, he introduces maximum instability.
Is it possible the stroke terrified him, confronting him with his own mortality and a potentially deeper level of caregiving, causing him to lash out defensively?
That's a very perceptive question.
Like, we are looking at a man who has managed cooking and cleaning, but a stroke introduces the possibility of a completely different tier of care.
Exactly. We are talking about mobility assistance, bathing, cognitive therapy.
So is this explosion essentially a massive panic attack, masking as rage?
That mechanism is highly probable. From a neurological standpoint, terror and rage frequently utilize the same pathways in the brain.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. When faced with a perceived existential threat, in this case, the total loss of his remaining autonomy to a severe caregiving burden, the amygdala triggers a fight-or-flight response.
And he chose fight.
He did. The sheer magnitude of her stroke shattered the fragile, miserable equilibrium they had established.
It forced him to stare directly at the reality of aging, decline, and profound physical dependence.
Exactly. His system panicked. He attacked the source of his anxiety.
But, understanding the architecture of a panic response does not mitigate the devastation it causes.
No, it absolutely does not.
The explanation of his fear does not neutralize the venom of his reaction.
The psychology behind his outburst provides context, but it offers zero absolution. Fear may dictate the internal panic, but cruelty is a choice in execution.
You can be paralyzed by the prospect of escalating care needs without actively trying to destroy your partner's self-esteem.
Right. The choice to attack her in her moment of greatest physical weakness is a deliberate act of emotional abandonment.
And we really have to consider the specific isolation of this happening at age 70.
The age factor is massive here.
Managing deep emotional isolation at any age is difficult. But at 70, the social landscape is often fundamentally different, isn't it?
It is. The social networks of individuals in their 70s are generally smaller and more heavily concentrated on the primary partnership.
So the reliance on the spouse is not just emotional, it is deeply logistical.
Precisely.
Yeah.
To be struck down by a neurological event and simultaneously realize that your primary support structure is actively hostile, creates an existential vertigo.
Existential vertigo, that's a chilling phrase.
It is the sudden, terrifying realization that you are entirely alone inside a failing body, inside a hostile home.
How does someone even begin to process that specific type of abandonment? Your brain is literally trying to rewire itself after a vascular trauma.
And simultaneously, you have to process the death of your marriage.
It's almost too much for one person to bear.
The processing has to begin with the explicit acknowledgement of grief. This cannot be bypassed. She must actively mourn the loss of the safe harbor.
She is grieving the illusion of the partner she thought would anchor her during a crisis.
Yes, and this requires radical cognitive reframing. She has to separate his reaction from her intrinsic worth.
So she has to realize his abandonment is a catastrophic failure of his emotional capacity, not an indictment of her value.
Exactly. When he looks at her and sees an intolerable burden, he is projecting his own profound limitations.
He is broadcasting his inability to love unconditionally.
Right. But that reframing is incredibly difficult work.
Especially because he wasn't just withdrawing. He didn't just pack a bag and say, "I'm too overwhelmed, I have to leave."
No, he stayed.
He stayed in the room and used his words to inflict maximum damage. He escalated the situation from abandonment to active verbal abuse.
And we need to look closely at the architecture of his attack.
Let's do that, because the specific insults he chose are incredibly revealing about his internal state.
The transition from resentment to verbal abuse is marked by the intent to degrade.
He targeted her physical appearance, calling her fat and ugly.
We have to categorize this clinically. This is an attempt to systematically dismantle her dignity.
It is also the most intellectually bankrupt, culturally weaponized insult available.
It really is. It's so base.
Women are conditioned from childhood to equate their societal value with aesthetic appeal in youth.
To have the person who has witnessed your body fight an autoimmune disease for 20 years suddenly use the physical toll of that battle as a weapon against you is vile.
Especially immediately following a stroke, when body autonomy and physical confidence are at absolute zero.
Abusers do not select insults randomly. They calculate the strike for maximum psychological penetration.
So by attacking her physical appearance, what is his end game?
He is attempting to render her grateful for his previous tolerance. He is trying to establish a dynamic where she feels so devoid of value that she will accept whatever scraps of care he is willing to provide.
Wow. It is a subjugation tactic.
Exactly. It's about control.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He is 70 years old and experiencing erectile dysfunction.
Yes, the ED.
Instead of facing his own aging body and medical realities, he is using his wife as a scapegoat.
Yeah.
It's like throwing a grenade into the living room so nobody notices the foundation of the house is sinking.
That's a brilliant way to put it. He creates this massive, violent distraction.
So the attention is entirely on her perceived flaws, rather than his physiological reality.
The mechanics of projection here are textbook. At 70, the statistical prevalence of erectile dysfunction is incredibly high.
Driven by what? Vascular changes.
Vascular changes, cellular aging, and frequently medications. It is a standard biological progression.
However, for a man whose ego is inextricably tied to his virility, the loss of erectile function is experienced as profound narcissistic injury.
Right. To accept the reality of his own aging body requires a level of emotional maturity and vulnerability that he clearly lacks.
So his ego engineers a bypass.
Precisely. Instead of confronting the fact that his vascular system is changing, he decides his equipment works perfectly fine, but the stimulus is the problem.
By stating that his erectile dysfunction is caused by her being fat and ugly, he completely absolves himself of the aging process.
He preserves his internal narrative of virility at the direct expense of her self-worth.
He is demanding that she carry the emotional weight of his physical decline, layering it on top of her own severe medical trauma.
It is an extraordinary abdication of personal responsibility.
And he doesn't stop at the projection. He introduces a specific, calculated threat to reinforce the narrative.
The Thailand comment.
Yes. He states he will travel to Thailand or anywhere to find women who will make him hard.
We must analyze the cultural and psychological weight of that specific geography.
It's not just a random country he picked out of a hat.
No, it's not. In the context of older men and sexual frustration, Thailand is globally recognized shorthand for the commercial sex tourism industry.
By invoking this, he's deploying a multi-layered psychological weapon.
First, he is explicitly commodifying intimacy. He is establishing that physical connection is merely a transaction.
And because she cannot fulfill the physical requirements of that transaction, he will simply purchase it elsewhere.
Exactly. He is reducing a 20-year shared history. The
Mhm.
inside jokes, the shared meals, the thousands of days spent together down to a purely mechanical function.
It's sickening. And the second layer of that threat is the explicit message of replaceability.
Right. He is telling her that any anonymous woman, thousands of miles away, holds more value to him than his wife of 2 decades, solely based on biological utility.
It is an attempt to totally obliterate her sense of uniqueness and security within the partnership. He wants her to feel interchangeable and utterly discarded.
When a partner utilizes this specific brand of emotional terrorism, the fundamental geometry of the relationship changes.
You are no longer in a troubled marriage.
No, you are in a hostile environment.
The central question shifts from how do we resolve this conflict to how do I survive this attack?
And that's exactly what she's asking for.
Right. The author ended her post with a plea for advice on how to respond. So let's get into the granular tactical execution of that response.
Let's do it.
How does a 70-year-old woman, physically compromised by a stroke, handle a man standing in her living room trying to obliterate her psyche?
The absolute first principle of responding to verbal abuse is understanding the futility of logic.
The futility of logic. Okay, elaborate on that.
Well, our neurological default when attacked is defensive. If someone accuses you of causing their erectile dysfunction, your instinct is to point out the biological absurdity of the claim.
Right, if someone calls you ugly, you want to defend your worth. You want to bring evidence to the courtroom.
You want to show them the facts so they will realize they are wrong and apologize.
But an abuser, in the middle of a verbal assault, is not operating in a rational framework.
Exactly. They are operating in a state of emotional dysregulation, and they are seeking a specific dopamine response.
They want friction.
They want friction. They want to see the pain land on your face, and they want the chaotic energy of your defense to validate their aggression.
So arguing back feeds the exact neurological loop they're trying to activate.
Therefore, the tactical response must be to completely starve that loop. She must not internalize the insult, and she must absolutely refuse to debate the premise.
This brings us to the execution of the gray rock approach.
Yes.
We hear this term thrown around a lot, but how does it actually function in real time?
The gray rock method is a cognitive behavioral strategy designed to make the target entirely uninteresting to the abuser.
You restrict your emotional reactions, right? Your facial expressions, your vocal inflection.
You become as boring and unresponsive as a gray rock. When he launches into his diatribe about her appearance or his virility, she must consciously disengage her emotional receiver.
So the internal monologue has to shift from, how can he say this to me, to, I am observing a person having an irrational outburst.
Yes, it requires clinical detachment. However, in this specific scenario, passive gray rocking is insufficient because the abuse is overt and aggressive.
So what's the active step?
She must pair the emotional detachment with an ironclad articulated boundary. She needs a single non-negotiable script.
Like what?
Something like, I will not engage in a conversation where I am being insulted.
She delivers the line without yelling, without crying, just a flat statement of fact.
Correct.
But realistically, he isn't going to hear that boundary and suddenly respect it, is he? An abuser usually escalates when their initial tactic fails to produce the desired distress.
The escalation is highly predictable, which is why the articulated boundary must be immediately followed by a physical boundary.
Okay, so the moment she states, I will not engage in a conversation where I am being insulted, what does she do?
She must physically remove herself from the environment. She turns and leaves the room. If he follows, she goes into a bedroom and locks the door.
The physical execution of leaving the room when you're recovering from a stroke and managing lupus fatigue, that is a monumental effort.
It is. The sheer energy required to stand up and walk away is significant. But it is the most critical physical investment she can make in her own dignity.
Refusing to be an audience to your own degradation is the ultimate reclamation of power.
It communicates, through action, that his access to her is entirely conditional on basic respect. When the respect evaporates, his access is revoked.
Okay, let's follow her into that quiet room after she closes the door. The immediate physical threat is gone, but the echo of the words remains.
Oh, the hardest part.
The psychological residue of being called useless, of the Thailand threat, that doesn't disappear just because the door is locked. This is the moment where survival hinges entirely on self-compassion.
We really need to define self-compassion clearly here because it is frequently conflated with self-esteem.
What's the difference?
Self-esteem is a global evaluation of your worth. It fluctuates based on success, appearance, and external validation.
And self-compassion.
Self-compassion is a behavioral practice. It is how you treat yourself in moments of profound failure, inadequacy, or victimization. It is the active application of warmth and understanding toward your own suffering.
We mentioned finding grace amidst personal pain earlier. Grace, in this context, is completely untethered from him.
Completely.
It has nothing to do with forgiving his outbursts or finding the patience to endure his cruelty.
No, grace is the radical act of treating her own bruised psyche with the profound gentleness he just denied her.
So to practice self-compassion behind that closed door, she must engage in self-validation.
She needs to speak to herself with the exact same vocabulary and tone she would use if her dearest friend had just endured that attack.
If a beloved friend called her, weeping, saying her husband had blamed her for his ED and threatened to hire sex workers while she recovered from a stroke, her reaction would be visceral.
She would be outraged on her friend's behalf.
She would relentlessly affirm her friend's beauty, her worth, and her absolute right to be treated with dignity.
Exactly. And she must systematically apply that exact protocol to herself.
For someone listening who feels trapped in a cycle of verbal hostility, who is desperately seeking some kind of inner peace while their living room feels like a war zone, how do you find peace when the external environment is in chaos?
The fundamental truth about inner peace in an abusive dynamic is that it can never be achieved through compliance.
You can't just follow their rules and hope for the best.
You will never find peace by attempting to modify yourself to placate the abuser. You cannot become healthy enough, quiet enough, or attractive enough to fix his internal dysfunction.
So where does peace come from?
Peace is only accessible through radical detachment.
So what does this all mean? It means uncoupling your self-concept from his validation.
You must arrive at the cold, clinical realization that his perception of reality is fundamentally distorted by his own ego and fear.
Therefore, his assessment of your worth is statistically invalid.
When he speaks, he is not providing data about your value. He is providing data about his own pathology. Detaching from the need for his approval is the mechanism that unlocks inner peace.
But uncoupling from the primary partner you have relied on for 20 years is an extraordinarily complex operation.
It's like unwiring a bomb.
Yeah, you don't just flip a switch and suddenly stop caring what your husband thinks. Rebuilding an independent sense of reality requires systemic action.
It requires pulling in external resources to counteract the gravitational pull of the abuse.
The pathway to individual healing must begin with the complete reorientation of her physical recovery.
Right now, her body feels like a liability.
It is the source of the lupus fatigue, the site of the stroke, and the target of his insults.
She must reframe her stroke rehabilitation. The physical therapy, the medication management, the resting, none of this should be framed as an attempt to restore her utility for the marriage.
Oh, that's powerful. It must be framed as a fierce, radical act of self-preservation.
Yes, she is strengthening her vessel for herself.
I want to emphasize that point. Reconnecting with your physical autonomy is the foundation of reconnecting with your psychological identity.
Who was she before the marriage?
Right. Who is she entirely outside the context of being a patient or a wife? She needs to locate the aspects of her intellect, her humor, and her spirit that have absolutely nothing to do with domestic chores or his virility.
And that excavation of her identity cannot be done in isolation. The isolation imposed by the illness and weaponized by the husband must be actively dismantled.
She requires community support to serve as an external mirror.
When you are subjected to repeated verbal degradation, your internal mirror warps.
You start to believe the things they say.
You do. You need other voices. A stroke survivor support group, online communities for chronic illness, re-engaged friendships to reflect a sane, accurate image of your worth back to you.
The community support is vital for the emotional scaffolding, but managing late-in-life verbal abuse requires specialized professional intervention.
A support group cannot safely navigate the complexities of what we are dealing with here.
No, there is a triad of professional resources she must engage immediately.
The first is a licensed mental health professional who specializes in chronic illness trauma and domestic abuse.
She needs a controlled clinical environment to unpack the 20-year history of this skewed dynamic.
She needs expert guidance to process the acute trauma of his recent attacks without internalizing the blame.
Therapy addresses the psychological triage, but there is a glaring practical threat looming over this situation.
The Thailand threat.
Exactly. He is explicitly expressing resentment regarding the marital vows. He feels exploited, and he's threatening international travel for sex.
These are the behavioral precursors to a unilateral exit.
Which necessitates the second professional resource. Immediate consultation with a family law attorney.
I can imagine the hesitation here.
We are just fighting. I don't want a divorce. Why would I escalate this to a lawyer?
Engaging an attorney is not an escalation. It is an intelligence-gathering mission. It is an act of extreme pragmatism.
She is 70 years old, physically disabled by lupus, and actively recovering from a major neurological event.
Her future medical and living expenses are guaranteed to be significant.
And her husband is highly volatile and making threats that indicate a willingness to sever the relationship and potentially misappropriate shared assets for his own gratification.
She must understand exactly what her legal rights are regarding alimony, asset division, and the preservation of her health insurance. Ignorance of her legal standing is a vulnerability she cannot afford.
You build the fortress before the army arrives, not while they are breaking down the gate. Understanding the financial reality gives her agency.
And there is a third critical resource that often gets overlooked in scenarios involving older demographics.
What's that?
She must contact a domestic abuse hotline.
There is a massive cultural blind spot here, isn't there? When people hear domestic abuse, the immediate association is a black eye or a broken bone.
If the violence isn't physical, the victims themselves often minimize the severity of their situation.
We must aggressively dismantle that misconception. Domestic abuse is a pattern of behavior used to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner.
The calculated, degrading verbal assaults, the specific targeting of her medical vulnerabilities, the threats of abandonment, the explicit attempts to destroy her self-worth, this is a textbook psychological and emotional abuse campaign.
And domestic abuse hotlines are staffed by professionals trained to navigate exactly this terrain.
They assist in creating a tangible safety plan. If his verbal aggression escalates, or if she simply decides the environment is too toxic for her stroke recovery, she needs a logistical plan.
Where does she go? How does she access her medications? Having these logistics documented removes the paralyzing friction of fear.
If we look at the trajectory of these steps, the boundaries, the therapy, the legal counsel, we are inherently preparing for the possibility of separation.
Facing the dissolution of a 20-year marriage at 70 is an objectively terrifying prospect. It feels like a colossal failure.
It is entirely natural to grieve the end of an era, but we must interrogate the framing of failure. Maintaining a marriage where your dignity is systematically dismantled is a failure of self-preservation.
If a separation occurs, it may present as a crisis initially, but it is ultimately a pathway to profound relief.
Imagine the sheer reduction in ambient cortisol levels.
For 20 years, she has existed in an atmosphere thick with silent resentment. Now, that resentment is loud and actively hostile.
Removing herself from that environment or having him leave allows the nervous system to finally downregulate.
The quiet of an empty house might be intimidating, but it is a prerequisite for authentic healing. Preserving personal dignity often requires amputating the relationship.
Separation is simply a structural change. Losing your psychological autonomy to a partner who weaponizes your biology against you is the true tragedy. She has the opportunity to reclaim her narrative.
We have covered an immense amount of psychological and practical ground today. As we close this deep dive, I want to bring it entirely back to the center.
This is our gentle but fierce letter of support to the author of that post.
Let's distill the absolute core of what she needs to hear.
The essential truths are these. Your illness is an arbitrary biological event, not a moral failing. You did not court lupus, and you did not invite a stroke.
The fatigue your husband experienced over the last 2 decades is a real consequence of your illness, but it provides absolutely no justification for verbal abuse.
You possess the unalienable right to set rigid boundaries, to walk out of the room, and to completely refuse participation in your own degradation.
Your worth is a static, immovable fact. It is entirely independent of his sexual frustrations. It is independent of your physical ability to perform domestic labor.
His cruel, calculated assessments of your body are nothing more than a projection of his own intense insecurities and his cowardice in the face of aging.
The navigation of this crisis demands profound self-compassion. You must become your own fiercest advocate.
And you must not do it alone. Utilize the professional architecture available to you, the therapists, the attorneys, the support networks. Your survival and recovery require external reinforcement.
And to you, the listener, the mechanics we discussed today transcend this specific scenario. Whether you are navigating the slow, grinding exhaustion of long-term caregiving, grappling with the guilt of being the patient, or suddenly finding yourself staring at a partner who has become hostile, the preservation of your individual dignity must be the absolute priority.
The external circumstances of our lives, our health, our partner's reactions, are frequently beyond our control.
But the internal boundary, the refusal to internalize abuse, remains your domain.
This raises an important question about the fundamental nature of the promises we make. We are culturally conditioned to view marital vows as an unbreakable, binding contract.
We repeat the words in sickness and in health, and we often pour every reserve of our energy into honoring that external commitment, sometimes to the point of our own psychological destruction.
We hold the line for the other person, even when they start tearing the house down from the inside.
But perhaps the most sacred vow we ever take is the unwritten one we make to ourselves, to fiercely protect our own spirit when the person we trusted most decides to abandon theirs.
Ultimately, the commitment to your own psychological survival is the only vow that guarantees a future worth living.
A profound point to end on. Stay safe, protect your peace, and we will be back next time with another deep dive.